Fiedler Audio recently released an update to the Dolby Atmos Composer and Spacelab plugins, and this update brings the long-awaited integration between the Spacelab Reverb plugin and the Dolby Atmos Composer. Now, I've already talked about that integration in a previous video where I had a pre-release version of Spacelab, so I felt it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do another video about that in particular. However, I still wanted to kind of talk about it, so what I decided to do instead is create another Getting Started with Dolby Atmos video, and this time with a digital audio workstation that I haven't touched before, and this digital audio workstation is Bitwig. And we're going to do everything in Windows. So today, how to get started with Dolby Atmos in Bitwig on Windows. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I'm a digital media educator with more than 30 years of experience in higher education. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. Today about how to get started with Dolby Atmos in Bitwig. If any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join our Discord community. Invite link is in the description below, or there's also a QR code here somewhere. And you can now also follow me on Instagram. Link in the description below. Before I open up Bitwig, I need to make two disclaimers. First of all, Fiedler Audio provided me with a review license for their Dolby Atmos Composer. However, no money has exchanged hands, and Fiedler Audio also doesn't have any influence on the videos I'm making. In fact, they don't even know that I'm making this particular video. And in addition to that, the license for Spacelab is something that I purchased myself. The second disclaimer is that I'm not a regular user of Bitwig. I do play around with it once in a while, but if you are a passionate Bitwig user, be aware that I might miss a shortcut here and there, so please don't be upset if I'm not doing everything exactly the way it's supposed to be done. And with that being said, let's open up our project. Now I'm going to use a project that I've actually used before. It consists of 3 loops, a drum loop, a synth loop, and a bass loop. A very simple one. So let's just have a listen. So once again, we have a drum loop here. Then a synth loop. And finally a bass loop. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn that project into a Dolby Atmos project using the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer, and we're going to add some reverb with the Spacelab reverb. And we're going to then export everything as a Dolby Atmos master file and check if that master file is actually okay. The first thing I need to do is I need to put an instance of the Dolby Atmos Composer plugin into my project. Now I can technically put that on any track I like. However, the obvious choice for that is the master track. So let's just do that. So I'm going to add a Dolby Atmos Composer plugin to our master track Composer. Here we are. And let's say okay. And I'm not going to talk too much about what Dolby Atmos really is. If you're interested in that, I did a couple of videos in the past where I kind of explained exactly what Dolby Atmos is. But to give you a very, very brief recap on Dolby Atmos, it is essentially a hybrid audio format that combines a channel-based component, which is called the Dolby Atmos bed, and an object-based component, which are the Dolby Atmos objects. And the first 10 channels are reserved for this channel-based component, the Dolby Atmos bed, that is a 7.1.2 bed by default, and the remaining 118 channels are objects, and that essentially kind of together makes up the Dolby Atmos master file. So that's sort of the very, very brief introduction. Once again, if you're interested in details, link in the description below. Now, if we want to now route a track into the Dolby Atmos Composer, we have to do that via the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin. So let's just route the synth track into the Composer first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a Beam plugin on the synth track. So here we have the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin. And as soon as I do that, the Dolby Atmos Composer will actually recognize that. And by default, it is going to send that into this channel-based component into the Dolby Atmos bed. So if you now play the project, I'm only going to hear the synth track. The reason for that is because everything else is sort of not going to pass through the composer and therefore is not going to be played. And I can do the obvious things. So essentially I can, for example, now change the location of my left and right speakers. So let's just kind of do it maybe like this. And that will essentially be replicated here in the Dolby Atmos Composer by kind of showing me the full 7.1.2 track in the composer itself. Now, one thing a lot of people get confused about is the fact that because the audio is sent into the composer through the Beam plugin and therefore never really reaches the fader, or at least it reaches the fader, but the audio that kind of passes through the fader is not going to actually reach the composer. That essentially means that the fader here has no effect. So if you want to have a setup where you want to use the fader, or where you would like to use the fader, what you would have to do is use a separate kind of effects track and then put the Beam plugin onto the effects track so that you can essentially kind of change the audio with the fader. If you do it the way I've done it here, you can essentially control the volume with the volume knob here in the Beam plugin itself, which is also fine. It really depends on how you want to prefer your workflow. Now, I can also turn that into an object, and the way this is done is by either kind of going into the pen mode here in the Beam plugin and kind of choosing object. And that will now turn that into an object, and it's going to grab the first two available object tracks, which are track number 11 and 12. And what is happening in the background here is that the audio is sent from the Beam plugin into the composer, and in addition to that, the panning information is sent as metadata from the Beam plugin into the composer. And when we export the Dolby Atmos master file, it will actually export those things separately. So it will export the audio, and in addition to that, the metadata which comes from the panning that is done in the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin. So if you're just working with the Dolby Atmos Composer, this is pretty much everything that you need to know. What you would now do is essentially go through all your individual tracks, put a Beam plugin onto each individual track, and then route each individual track into the Dolby Atmos Composer. Change the position of those tracks, kind of move them around in three-dimensional space, maybe automate a little, and then essentially you're already getting a very nice kind of three-dimensional impression of your audio project. However, we want to kind of take that one step further, and we're going to do that with the Spacelab plugin. What we want to do is we want to add reverb to individual tracks, and the way we're going to do that is that we are going to send the dry signal as an object into the Dolby Atmos Composer, and the wet signal is going to be a 7.1.2 reverb that we're going to send into the Dolby Atmos bed. And this is something that can be done very, very easily with the Spacelab plugin. So let's have a look on how that works. So in order to get a reverb going, what I need to do is I need to add an instance of Spacelab into my project. Now I can once again do that on any track I like. However, the obvious choice here would be an effects or return track. So I'm going to use the one track that I already have here, which is called FX1, and I'm going to add an instance of Spacelab. So let's just search for Spacelab. And I'm going to use Spacelab Interstellar, which is sort of the full version of Spacelab. If you have Spacelab Ignition, everything just works in exactly the same way. So you don't need to purchase the full version. The cheaper Ignition version is perfectly fine. But I'm going to work with Interstellar here because that's what I have. So let's just add Spacelab Interstellar. Now, as soon as I've added Spacelab Interstellar, you will see that the Dolby Atmos Composer has recognized that there is now an instance of Interstellar or of Spacelab in my project, and it has added that. And anything that is sort of sent into Spacelab is now directly kind of forward into the Dolby Atmos Composer. It set a couple of things by default. It kind of assumes that we want a stereo track or a stereo reverb, and that essentially is then routed into the Dolby Atmos bed, which kind of occupies the first two channels. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to actually change that to an immersive reverb. So what I'm going to do is, instead of having stereo here, I'm going to actually switch that over to Dolby Atmos 7.1.2. That will make sure that the reverb actually kind of takes advantage of the full 10 channels that I have in the Dolby Atmos bed. That essentially also means that if I now go into the reverb settings of Spacelab, I will actually see that the output format now is 7.1.2, which kind of corresponds to what I've set here in the Composer. Now, the next thing I need to do is I need to kind of simply send audio into Spacelab, and this is done in pretty much the same way we work with the Dolby Atmos Composer. There is a Beam plugin that we need to use. In this particular case, it's not the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin that we used here, and let me just click that away because we don't need it anymore. It's now the Spacelab Beam plugin, and let's first do the drums. So essentially I'm going to add an instance of Spacelab Beam. So let's search for Beam, and we're going to use Spacelab Beam, once again, Spacelab Beam, not Dolby Atmos Beam, Spacelab Beam, because that's the one that sends into Spacelab. And this will now be responsible for sending the audio from the drum track into the Spacelab plugin. Now, there are a couple of things that we need to do before we can actually continue working with that. And the first thing we need to do is we need to kind of fix the routing. So let me just kind of show you what is happening right now. So if I'm playing the track now, it's not really doing anything. And the reason for that is because Spacelab does not recognize that automatically. So the first thing we need to do is we need to tell Spacelab which Beam plugins it's supposed to listen to. Now, the reason this is not done automatically is simply because you can have multiple instances of Spacelab in your project. And that essentially means you need to manually tell each instance which of the Beam plugins it should listen to. Now, this is done by setting up the sources here. We already have one source prepared. So all we really need to do is we need to go into the cogwheel here and kind of select the input that we're going to use. And we currently only have one Beam plugin that is in the project, which is the Beam plugin that kind of belongs to the drums track. So let's select that one, and then essentially now Spacelab is capable of listening to that Beam plugin. But we still have a couple of things to do. So let me just kind of play the audio now, and we are going to actually have an issue here. So there's a little bit of crackling going on. Now, this is fortunately very easy to fix. Now, my understanding is that this is primarily happening because the processing is a little bit confused by the routing. So currently what we have is we have the audio routed from the drum track through the Spacelab Beam plugin into the Interstellar plugin and from there into the composer. However, within Bitwig, that track is actually routed directly into the master, and apparently during processing, the Bitwig gets confused a little. So what we need to do is we need to also make sure that the routing in Bitwig mirrors what we have with the Spacelab plugins. So instead of routing the drums track into the master directly, what we need to do is we need to route that into the plugin or into the track that holds the Spacelab plugin. And as soon as we've done that, that crackling should disappear. So let's just kind of see if we no longer have any crackling. So yeah, the crackling disappeared. However, there's one final issue that we have, and in order to show that, let me just close the Spacelab plugin. And as you see, essentially, as soon as I close the plugin, the audio disappears. And the reason for that is because Bitwig gets confused a little. Because what is happening right now is that the audio kind of is sent from Spacelab Beam plugin into the Interstellar plugin, into Spacelab, and from the Interstellar plugin into the Dolby Atmos Composer. There is no audio going from the track into the Spacelab track, and there's no audio going from the Spacelab track into the master track. So what Bitwig thinks is that there's actually no audio going through the track, and therefore it's going to put every plugin that is on the track into sleep mode. So the one thing that we need to do is we need to kind of make sure that the plugin is not suspended by Bitwig. And this is essentially done if you go into the plugin setting, essentially suspend from trust plugin to never. That essentially means that we are never going to suspend this plugin because the plugin is working even though Bitwig thinks it is not working. So let me just kind of play that again now. And now everything is working correctly. So there's one final thing I want to do is, and that is I want to separate out the object from the reverb itself, and that is done in the Dolby Atmos, in the Spacelab plugin. So let me go back into the mixer here and let's just open up the Spacelab Interstellar plugin here. And essentially what I want to do is I want to separate out the object from the reverb. So this is done by clicking on the object button here. So as soon as I do that, it will actually generate two additional, it will kind of allocate two additional objects for the track that essentially is coming out of the drums track. So let's just play that again. So we now have the object, so the drums as an object is going into channels 13 and 14, and the reverb is going into the Atmos pad. Now we can actually kind of listen to that by muting either the pad or the object. So let's just mute the objects. So this is sort of the reverb. It's a little much, so we're going to reduce that in a second. Or we can mute the reverb and then essentially only listen to the objects. So the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to simply adjust the reverb a little. So I'm going to kind of reduce the wet signal a little bit. That seems fine. So the last thing I need to do is I need to do the same thing for the remaining track, the bass track. I'm going to send that into the Spacelab reverb plugin in the same way I kind of worked with the drums in order to add a little bit of reverb, and I'm going to separate that out in the very same way into the object and the reverb itself. So the wet signal is going to go into the bed and the dry signal is going to go into objects. So let's do that. So first I need to add an instance of the Beam plugin, the Spacelab Beam plugin, to the bass track. Then I need to tell Spacelab that I want to actually listen to that Beam plugin. So let's add an additional source. And in the cogwheel, let's select that bass track as the source. Then I need to go into the composer and select objects so that I can separate out the objects from the wet signal from the dry signal. So once again, the dry signal is going to go into tracks number 15 and 16, and the wet signal is going to go into the Dolby Atmos bed. And the final thing I need to do is I need to make sure that the routing in Bitwig is correct, because if I play it right now, I'm going to have a lot of crackles because Bitwig gets a little bit confused about how the routing works. So instead of sending that into the master track, I actually need to send that into the track that holds the Spacelab Interstellar plugin. And once I've done that, I should now be fine and hear everything. So let's see what we hear. So everything so far is fine. Now if I look into Spacelab, I now see that the bass track is actually, or both speakers of the Spacelab are kind of put together here into this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of separate them out. So maybe something like this. So the last thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit of automation. And the reason I'm doing that is because the automation in Spacelab works a little bit different to what I'm normally used to. In order to be able to actually automate the parameters within Spacelab, we first need to expose them to the digital audio workstation. Now, the way this is done, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply add a little bit of automation that moves this bass track, these kind of two speakers, these two objects that sort of belong to the bass track, that moves them kind of back and forth a little. Now, in order to do that, we need to click on the reverb button here. And in the reverb button, we have under the settings here, we have this automation settings. Now, what we need to do is we need to add a lane group. And that essentially means we need to expose certain, or we want to expose certain parameters for automation in Bitwig. So let's add a lane group here. And then we need to click on setup, and in setup we can now select which parameters we want to automate, and kind of that is we want to automate the position, X, Y, and Z position, and then I have the individual objects that I have. I can either automate the listener position or the tracks that I have. In my particular case, I'm really only interested in the bass, so let's add that. So let's add that lane group, and then we need to assign the host parameters. So we need to tell it which parameters these kind of parameters are exposed to, and we're simply going to use the first available ones. So this is 1 and 3, and we're going to say OK. Now, once we have done that, what we need to do is we need to click here on automate. That essentially now means that I'm no longer kind of controlling the parameters manually, actually controlling them through automation. And the final thing I need to do is I need to simply add an automation lane. Now, I've already kind of opened it up here, so let's just add. And now we have exposed the parameters here, X, Y, and Z. And what we're going to do is we're going to simply select Y, because we're just going to kind of move it back and forth a little. And then let's just add some points. And let me click that away because I don't really need those anymore, at least not for the moment. Let's maybe add a second one here in the middle somewhere. Yeah. And the final one here. Oops. Let's bring that back. So this is essentially going to move the object from the back to the front and then back again. So let's see how that works. Let's open up Interstellar and let's see if we actually have some automation going on. So let's just kind of play our sound. And yes, we do. So if you want to automate parameters in Spacelab, you actually have to first tell Spacelab which parameters you want to expose, and then you can access those parameters from within Bitwig. So the last thing I want to do is I want to export the project as a Dolby Atmos master file, and this is done very easily with the Dolby Atmos Composer. Now, before I do anything, I need to turn off the looping here, because otherwise the Dolby Atmos Composer is going to get a little bit confused. Then I'm going to open up the composer here, and I need to set the in points and the out points. So in my particular case, I set the in point to be 0 and the out point to be 18 seconds. The entire loop is about 16 or so seconds long. I can also set the options depending on what type of output I want. Do I want the Dolby Atmos Masterfile? Do I want the renderer or the render of the speaker output, or do I want the render of the headphone output, or do I want to have multiple of those? I can actually select it here, but I'm just going to select the ADM BWF, so the Dolby Atmos Masterfile. And then essentially all I really need to do is kind of press the export button. Let's call that test. I already have a file test here because I just tested that. So let's replace that, and then all I really need to do is click play and it should record. And I see the progress here. And once it's done, it's going to come back and tell me that the file is completed. Okay, export successful. And I have my Dolby Atmos Masterfile. Now, this export can be a little bit fiddly. Be aware of that. Sometimes it doesn't hit the beginning, the in point or the out point. You just need to kind of be a little bit patient and kind of give it multiple tries. And eventually it will kind of export correctly. So be aware that the Dolby Atmos Masterfile is not something that you can play back on a regular media player. It would actually not play back correctly. The Dolby Atmos Masterfile is something that you use in order to submit your production to a streaming service for distribution. So it's not a file that you can actually play. It's a file that you submit. Now, this is really everything I wanted to say today. Thanks again for watching my videos. If you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below or join our Discord community. Embed link is in the description below. And with that being said, see you at the next video.